On March 2, 1945, over the mist-veiled horizon of northern Germany, the first light of dawn caught something unfamiliar in the sky. From the cockpit of his battered Messerschmitt Bf 109, Oberleutnant Hans Keller squinted eastward, where the rising sun revealed a formation of aircraft glinting silver against the pale horizon. They were enormous, silent, too high. At first, Keller thought they were a mirage, the upper air shimmering after another night of Allied raids. But then his radio crackled with alarm from ground control near Münster. Unknown formation! Altitude over 30,000! Moving east to west. Not B-17s! He banked sharply, climbing hard, but his altimeter barely touched 24,000 feet before his engine coughed. The shapes above never wavered. Sunlight flashed along their vast wings, long as train cars. Their contrails formed pale ribbons that stretched endlessly across the dawn. Keller realized what he was seeing wasn't just another bomber wave. It was something else entirely, something beyond reach. That morning, as those massive silver aircraft vanished into the sunrise, the Luftwaffe's remaining pilots understood a quiet, dreadful truth. The age of German air power had ended. By early 1945, the sky over Europe no longer belonged to Germany. What had once been the proud domain of the Luftwaffe, that fearsome guardian of the Reich, had become a graveyard of smoke trails and shattered engines. The airfields that once launched squadrons across the continent now stood half-abandoned, their runways cratered by Allied bombs, their hangars hollow and quiet. The Third Reich was collapsing from the air downward. Allied bombers, the B-17 Flying Fortress and the consolidated B-24 Liberator, crossed the channel almost daily. Each carried tons of bombs that fell with relentless precision on cities, factories, and rail lines. The Reich's once vaunted air defense network, once a masterpiece of radar coordination and night fighter tactics, was disintegrating under the sheer weight of numbers. By the winter of 1944, Germany could no longer replace what it lost. Fuel was scarce, pilots younger by the month, and replacement aircraft often arrived incomplete or grounded by mechanical failures. The sky itself had become hostile terrain, and yet, despite the Allied dominance, victory from the air was not absolute. The B-17s and B-24s could reach deep into Germany, but they paid in blood for every mile. Luftwaffe fighter wings, though battered, still exacted a toll. Thousands of airmen never returned. Allied planners knew that to truly end the war from above, they needed a new kind of machine, one that could strike farther, fly higher, and endure longer than anything the world had ever seen. The answer was already being built across the Atlantic. In the factories of Boeing, a secret project was taking shape, an aircraft so ambitious that many doubted it could ever fly. Its name was the B-29 Superfortress. Unlike the bombers pounding Europe, the B-29 was designed for a different kind of war, one fought across oceans and through jet streams. Its pressurized fuselage allowed crews to operate at altitudes near 32,000 feet, far beyond the effective range of most flak guns. Its remote-controlled turrets, guided by analog computing sites, could engage attackers with astonishing accuracy. Each aircraft was a self-contained fortress in the sky, faster, larger, and deadlier than any bomber before it. But in early 1944, the B-29 was still a secret. It wasn't meant for the skies over Germany. Its intended target lay half a world away, the Japanese home islands. From new bases carved into the coral of the Marianas, Tinian, Saipan, and Guam, the superfortress would become the instrument of destruction that could finally bring Tokyo to its knees. Still, the war in Europe was watched closely by American planners. They saw the lessons learned over the Ruhr and Berlin, the futility of low-altitude bombing, the heavy losses from mass formations, and they refined them. The B-29 would take those lessons to their logical extreme. It would climb higher, carry more, and strike with mechanical precision. By the end of 1944, the first squadrons were testing their limits in the Pacific. Reports reached London and Washington of aircraft cruising at altitudes untouched by enemy fire, carrying bomb loads double those of the Flying Fortress. In the shadow of those achievements, even the legendary B-17 began to look obsolete. And though the B-29's mission was Pacific-centered, whispers about it began to circulate in Europe. Allied intelligence briefings mentioned a super bomber, one that could reach any target on Earth. The rumors spread beyond Allied lines, carried by neutral journalists, intercepted communications, and prisoners of war. Inside Germany, those whispers reached Luftwaffe intelligence. They dismissed them at first, propaganda perhaps, but by the spring of 1945, as radar operators along the North Sea began picking up mysterious high-altitude signals, disbelief turned into alarm. To the exhausted German pilots who glimpsed them, those distant, shimmering shapes were not just aircraft. They were omens, symbols of a technological gap that could no longer be bridged. The Reich had reached its limit. America had just crossed into a new age of warfare. The sight of those aircraft at sunrise over the fatherland would become the moment of realization, when even the proudest Luftwaffe ace knew that the war in the air was already lost. Long before the B-29s, silver fuselage appeared above German skies. Its legend had already arrived among Luftwaffe officers. It was whispered about in the same tone they once used for the British chain-home radar network, or the V-2 rocket, as a weapon so far, ahead of its time that no countermeasure yet existed. By late 1944, fragments of intelligence reports trickled into Berlin. German agents in Switzerland intercepted American press briefings hinting at a new strategic bomber operating in Asia, capable of flying higher than any interceptor could climb. The Abwehr dismissed some of it as exaggeration. Yet when Japanese military attachés sent desperate cables describing enemy planes beyond reach of our Zero fighters, the tone changed. It was not just another bomber. It was the embodiment of American industrial will, millions of parts assembled in secrecy, thousands of engineers solving problems no one else dared attempt. Pressurization, remote fire control, radar bombing, these were technologies that existed in theory, not in mass production. Yet the United States had done it. Inside Germany, the contrast was painful. Factories in Augsburg and Regensburg were still repairing Me-109s built on pre-war designs. Jet projects like the Me-262 promised salvation, but engine shortages, fuel scarcity, and political interference crippled progress. Meanwhile, the Allies were fielding aircraft that looked like something from the future. Every German pilot understood altitude was survival. The higher you flew, the longer you lived. But the B-29 redefined that boundary. Climbing to heights no piston engine interceptor could sustain. Even the high-altitude Ju-86P reconnaissance aircraft, once a source of pride, could not reach the altitudes where the superfortress cruised effortlessly. In the Pacific, American crews were already learning how to use this advantage. They bombed the Japanese steel centers of Yawata and Omura from altitudes where flak bursts hung helplessly below them. The bombers returned with barely a scratch, while Japan scrambled to adapt. Those after-action reports filtered through intelligence channels and soon found their way into German analysis rooms. At the Luftwaffe High Command in Berlin, General Lieutenant Josef Schmid reviewed intercepted fragments describing B-29 strikes on Saipan and Tokyo. His conclusion was chillingly clear. If this bomber were ever deployed in Europe, Germany would have no defense. He quietly reported as much to Göring, who dismissed it as defeatism. Still, among frontline pilots, the fear grew real. They had already watched the Allies evolve, from the slow Bristol Blenheim to the roaring P-51 Mustang that now escorted bombers over Berlin. Every time Germany built something new, the Allies built something better, faster, more numerous. The B-29 was the next step, a reminder that the technological race was no longer a contest. It was a one-sided pursuit. Then came the sightings. Radar operators along the Dutch and Danish coasts began noting strange echoes at extreme altitudes. Weather balloons, they were told. But the echoes moved too steadily, too fast. One early March morning in 1945, multiple Luftwaffe stations along the Weser River recorded a formation flying west to east, above 30,000 feet, maintaining a velocity near 350 miles per hour. Fighters scrambled from Wunstorf and Jagel, but none could climb high enough to intercept. Pilots who reached visual range reported seeing massive aircraft glinting in sunlight, 4-engine bombers, larger than any they had ever encountered. One described their contrails as straight, white lines running from the sun to the sea. Another swore the aircraft had a strange, polished finish that reflected the dawn like a mirror. In truth, these were reconnaissance overflights, a handful of B-29s diverted from the Pacific to test equipment and high-altitude routes. But to the exhausted German airmen, they were phantoms of inevitability. They represented not a new target, but the death of the old way of war. For a Luftwaffe already bleeding from every front, the psychological effect was enormous. Young pilots asked their instructors if the Americans would soon send these super bombers over Berlin. Ground crews wondered aloud how one could fight something that couldn't be reached. Even hardened aces began to doubt. By the time dawn broke on that March morning when Oberleutnant Keller saw the formation vanish into sunlight, the myth had already solidified. The Americans had built an aircraft the Reich could neither match nor stop, and while few Germans would ever face the B-29 directly, the thought of it lingered like a shadow. Proof that the war's future had already passed them by. To understand the fear the B-29 inspired, one must grasp the distance, not in miles, but in years, that separated it from everything else in the sky. In 1945, most German aircraft still bore the DNA of the late 1930s. The Me-109, the FW-190, rugged and agile, but cramped, noisy, and unpressurized. Their pilots battled gravity, cold and engine strain with every climb. The B-29 was another world entirely. It was the first bomber built around the idea of altitude, a machine designed to operate where the air was too thin for most fighters to follow. Its pressurized cabin allowed its crew to fly in relative comfort at 31,000 feet, wearing shirt sleeves while German interceptors below froze in open cockpits. Its Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone engines were marvels of engineering, powerful but temperamental, producing enough thrust to carry the bomber nearly 3,500 miles, with a payload that dwarfed anything the Luftwaffe could dream of. Even its defensive system defied convention. Instead of gunners hunched over fixed turrets, the B-29 used remote-controlled stations linked to analog computers. A gunner could aim using a sight bubble, and electric servos would adjust the guns automatically, calculating lead, range, and motion in milliseconds. To a German pilot used to manual tracers and gunsight estimation, it was almost alien technology. Radar-equipped Norden bomb sights gave the superfortress an unprecedented reach. Weather, darkness, or smoke mattered less. It was not just a bomber. It was a precision instrument at a time when precision itself was luxury. If the Me-109 represented the peak of piston-era craftsmanship, the B-29 was the first whisper of the computer age. It was, in every sense, a flying statement of American industry, proof that war was no longer won by bravery alone, but by engineering at scale. For German pilots, the psychological toll of fighting overwhelming odds had long been real. But the B-29 added something new, the fear of irrelevance. By early 1945, Luftwaffe morale was already in ruins. Pilots returned from missions with empty eyes. Their friends vanished daily, not even names on casualty lists anymore. They had seen everything, the endless waves of B-17s, the P-51 Mustangs slicing through formations like silver daggers. Yet the B-29 felt different. It was not the volume of attack that frightened them. It was the notion of inaccessibility. To a pilot, the sky is the last refuge. It is the one domain where human skill can still triumph. But when an aircraft flies higher than your machine can climb, your world shrinks. You can't fight what you can't reach. When radar plots showed the B-29s above 30,000 feet, the radio chatter in Luftwaffe command rooms turned quiet. The young pilots who scrambled that morning climbed until their engines stuttered, then leveled out, powerless, watching contrails fade beyond their range. That silence, the helplessness, left a mark, deeper than defeat in combat. It was the moment the Luftwaffe collectively understood. That courage no longer equaled capability. The war had moved beyond men into machines, and the Americans were building faster than the Germans could dream, the B-29s. Presence in European skies, even in limited reconnaissance form, symbolized more than technological prowess. It represented industrial inevitability. By the time the B-29 reached operational maturity, Germany's war economy was already collapsing. Allied bombing had crippled fuel supplies, railways, and the synthetic oil plants that kept its vehicles moving. The Reich was fighting on fumes. In contrast, the United States had built the largest industrial base in history. Entire cities in Kansas, Nebraska, and Washington were devoted to aircraft production. In Wichita, a B-29 rolled off the assembly line every day, a pace that Germany could not match even with all its factories combined. To the Allied High Command, the B-29 was more than a bomber. It was a tool of post-war dominance. It could reach any continent, any city, any enemy. Its operational ceiling placed it beyond interception. Its endurance made it intercontinental. And its payload hinted at the future, when bombs would carry not explosives, but unimaginable power. German strategists realized too late what it meant. Even if the Reich could produce hundreds of jet fighters, they would still face a bomber that rendered interception almost meaningless. Speed could not replace reach. Bravery could not compensate for altitude. Thus, when the first silver silhouettes appeared over northern Germany at sunrise, they were not merely a new threat. They were a symbolic obituary. An empire that had once dominated the skies of Europe now stood beneath aircraft that seemed to belong to another century, and, as those contrails stretched westward, the realization settled in every German command post. The Allies were not just winning the war, they were defining the future. Inside the B-29, the war looked strangely distant. Crews flew higher than weather, above the clouds and flak bursts that had haunted earlier bombers. Below them, Europe stretched out in miniature, rivers like silver wires, cities reduced to gray patches, roads mere scratches on the earth. For the men aboard, the silence inside the pressurized cabin was uncanny. The thunder of engines was dampened, conversations traveled through intercoms, and the cold outside, 60 degrees below zero, was kept at bay by controlled heat. It was modern, efficient, almost surgical. Yet that detachment brought a new weight of conscience. Many veterans later recalled that the higher they flew, the more abstract the destruction felt, and the more difficult it was to reconcile. Bombardier Lieutenant Charles Edwards, who flew early test sorties from British airfields in spring 1945, wrote in his diary, "You don't feel like you're in a war up there. It's too clean, too quiet. But when you look down and see the smoke rising, you remember what's beneath it. For the Luftwaffe pilots below, the human experience was the opposite, immediate and visceral. They fought with their bodies pressed against the limits of machinery, straining engines, freezing canopies, and the constant vibration of gunfire. Every interception attempt meant flirting with altitude ceilings, oxygen starvation, and the edge of blackout. One German ace, Oberleutnant Karl-Heinz Schüppel, described it in his post-war memoir, "We would climb until the air felt like needles in our lungs. The B-29s were dots we could barely see, and by the time we reached them, our guns froze or our engines coughed. It was like trying to fight a storm cloud. That contrast, one side in near silence, the other gasping for air, captured the human reality of a war entering its mechanical endgame." The Luftwaffe's first reaction to the appearance of the B-29 was disbelief. Intelligence officers initially thought the reports referred to modified B-17s or B-24s. Only after radar and high-altitude photographs confirmed the sightings did German High Command begin to understand what they faced. There was no easy countermeasure. The Me-262 jet fighter, still rare and mechanically unreliable, could theoretically reach the B-29's altitude, but not sustain combat there. The Me-163 Comet, a rocket-powered interceptor, could climb even higher, but only for minutes, and with barely enough fuel for a single attack run. German engineers proposed radical solutions: new radar-guided flak, vertical climb jets, even long-range guided missiles, but these remained blueprints. The Reich no longer had the time, resources, or industrial stability to turn desperation into innovation. Meanwhile, Allied strategists saw the psychological advantage the B-29 offered. Even limited appearances caused chaos in German radar networks and air defense commands. Units were scrambled unnecessarily, wasting precious fuel. Every sighting, real or mistaken, forced the Luftwaffe to respond. It was a silent form of warfare. Disruption through presence. The message was simple. If these aircraft could appear over Germany, they could reach anywhere. And though the B-29 never conducted large-scale bombing runs over Europe before the war's end, its very existence forced the Luftwaffe to divert attention from immediate threats. In that sense, the superfortress achieved what its name implied. It conquered by intimidation as much as by firepower. The moral implications of the B-29's power became clearer as the war drew to its close, when word spread that these aircraft would soon operate in the Pacific. Against cities even larger than Berlin, some Allied officers felt uneasy. The scale of destruction possible with such machines challenged the boundaries between warfare and annihilation. German officers, too, recognized the transformation. Captured Luftwaffe documents reveal that some commanders, while bitter at defeat, admitted admiration for the technological discipline the B-29 represented. One noted, "This is not war as we have known it, it is the science of destruction." For the Americans, moral reflection came later. At the time, the B-29 was a triumph of ingenuity, the culmination of industrial might and human coordination. Its crews were proud, its engineers celebrated, its mission seen as decisive. Yet within months, the same aircraft would deliver atomic bombs over Japan, forever linking its name to both the end of war and the beginning of an ethical reckoning. In that light, the reactions of the German pilots in 1945 gain a tragic resonance. They were not just witnessing defeat. They were glimpsing the dawn of a new kind of warfare, one where altitude and precision became precursors to something far more absolute. The moral question lingered quietly behind every contrail. When does technological progress stop being protection and start becoming terror? The B-29 did not answer that question, but it forced humanity to confront it. As the last of those reconnaissance flights ended and the war in Europe neared collapse, the dawn sightings of B-29s faded into legend, whispered among pilots who would never forget the morning the future appeared above them. That moment of awe, fear, and inevitability would soon converge into something even greater, because when the B-29 finally unleashed its full potential, it would not be over Germany, but over Japan. On November 24, 1944, 24 B-29s of the 73rd Bomb Wing lifted off from Saipan. Their destination, Tokyo. It was the first time in history that Japan's capital would face direct bombing from aircraft launched nearly 1,500 miles away, a distance once thought impossible. For the crews, the takeoff was both a technical marvel and a gamble. Each bomber, loaded with fuel and 500-pound bombs, weighed nearly 140,000 pounds, so heavy that one engine failure on takeoff could mean disaster. The strip at Isley Field shimmered under the tropical sun as the silver giants rolled one by one into the air, engines roaring at full throttle, wheels lifting just above the surf. Inside the lead aircraft, dauntless Dottie, Brigadier General Emmett O'Donnell Jr. watched the horizon. His order had been clear: prove that the superfortress could strike Japan from the newly captured Mariana Islands. Success would mean a new era of warfare. Failure would be catastrophic, both strategically and symbolically. As the formation climbed to altitude, the Pacific stretched endlessly below. The bombers flew over nothing but ocean for 7 hours before the faint outline of Honshu appeared through a haze of clouds. Tokyo, sprawling, congested, built largely of wood, waited beneath them. The raid itself was modest by later standards, but its significance was seismic. The B-29s reached the target at 30,000 feet, above most anti-aircraft fire. Their bomb bays opened in perfect sequence, releasing a cascade of explosives that glittered briefly before disappearing into the clouds. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the Japanese home islands were under direct assault from the sky. Japanese radar had detected the bombers earlier, but few interceptors could reach them. The Mitsubishi J-2M Raiden and Kai-44 Shoki fighters that tried to climb to engagement altitude struggled against the thin air and fuel limitations. Most never even saw the enemy. From the ground, the sight was haunting: silver specks tracing white lines across the sky, distant and untouchable. Anti-aircraft bursts bloomed ineffectively thousands of feet below. Tokyo's residents watched in stunned disbelief. Even those who had endured earlier Doolittle raids could not imagine aircraft this large, this high and this calm in their approach. It was, in every sense, a demonstration. The B-29 had not come merely to bomb. It had come to announce the arrival of an unstoppable reach. But the mission also revealed the bomber's fragility. Engine fires plagued the R-3350s. Navigation over the open ocean was uncertain. Many crews returned with burned pistons or failed fuel systems. Of the 24 aircraft, 2 were lost. One to engine failure, another to unknown causes over the sea. Yet the symbolism outweighed the losses. Tokyo had been hit, and the Americans had proven that no ocean could shield Japan any longer. From that first mission onward, the B-29 campaign escalated. New airfields were carved out on Tinian and Guam. By January 1945, over 300 B-29s operated under the newly formed Uxtiyuan Bomber Command led by General Curtis LeMay. LeMay's strategy was relentless. Precision by day, saturation by night. The initial attempts at high-altitude bombing proved inconsistent due to jet stream winds and cloud cover, but LeMay's ruthless pragmatism soon changed tactics. He ordered the bombers lower, much lower. Instead of 30,000 feet, they would fly at 5,000. Instead of general-purpose bombs, they would carry napalm and incendiaries. The result was the firebombing of Tokyo on March 9–10, 1945, a turning point not only in the air war but in the moral landscape of modern conflict. That night, 334 B-29s swept over the city in waves, guided by radar and low-level visual markers. Their bomb loads, a mix of M69 incendiaries and cluster devices, created a perfect storm of fire. Within hours, 16 square miles of Tokyo vanished in flame. Temperatures reached 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind generated its own tornadoes. Entire neighborhoods were erased. At dawn, smoke still covered the bay. Tens of thousands were dead. The city burned for 2 days. From their high vantage points, returning crews could see the glow from hundreds of miles away. The mission had been militarily successful. Industrial districts destroyed, war production crippled. But among the crews, a somber realization spread. They had just unleashed a level of destruction unlike anything the world had ever seen. In the words of one B-29 pilot, it was not war anymore. It was a storm we had built. LeMay, characteristically unmoved in public, later admitted privately that he understood what he had begun. "If we lose," he said, "we'll be tried as war criminals." The B-29 had become more than an aircraft. It was a policy, a new language of warfare, where the line between strategy and annihilation blurred. From the charred ruins of Tokyo to the trembling survivors who crawled from fire trenches, the lesson was unmistakable. Technology had outrun humanity's ability to contain it. Yet for the moment, within the command rooms of Guam and Washington, the mission was considered a triumph, and with that success came the final escalation, one that would end the war and redefine civilization itself. Because while Tokyo burned, a different kind of bomb was being prepared in secrecy, and the aircraft chosen to deliver it was already waiting. Its silver wings polished, its engines tuned, its crew handpicked for history. On August 6, 1945, 3 silver aircraft lifted off from North Field, Tinian. Their destination was Hiroshima, a city that, until that morning, had escaped the ruin that had befallen much of Japan. In the lead aircraft, Enola Gay, Colonel Paul Tibbets sat at the controls. The flight plan had been rehearsed dozens of times. Weather reconnaissance aircraft had already confirmed clear skies over the target. The bomb, codenamed Little Boy, rested in the bay, its uranium core armed mid-flight by the weaponeer, Captain William Parsons. After nearly 6 hours of flight, Tibbets released the bomb from an altitude of 31,000 feet. 43 seconds later, Hiroshima ceased to exist. The flash was brighter than sunlight, visible more than 350 miles away. A shockwave followed, flattening everything within 2 miles. Temperatures reached over 4,000 degrees Celsius. Concrete melted, steel twisted. Human shadows were burned into walls. 80,000 people were dead within minutes. Tens of thousands more would die in the days that followed. The crew, flying away at top speed, turned back to see a mushroom cloud rising more than 40,000 feet into the air. Co-pilot Robert Lewis wrote in his logbook, "My God, what have we done?" Below, Hiroshima was burning, its rivers choked with debris and bodies, its silence broken only by wind and distant cries. For the first time in history, mankind had harnessed the energy of the atom in war, and the B-29 had been its messenger. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second B-29 boxcar took off under Major Charles Sweeney. Its target was Kokura, but heavy smoke forced the crew to divert to Nagasaki. At 11:02 hours, the bomb known as Fat Man fell through broken clouds and detonated at 1,750 feet above the city's Urakami Valley. The explosion released energy equivalent to 21,000 tons of TNT. The destruction was immediate and total. Factories, homes, temples, all vanished. Over 70,000 were killed. The survivors carried burns and radiation injuries that defied comprehension. That same day, reports reached Tokyo. Military communications fell silent. The imperial cabinet entered crisis. Emperor Hirohito, until then distant from direct military affairs, was finally briefed in full on the scale of devastation. His response was measured, almost quiet. "We must endure the unendurable." The next morning, B-29s filled the skies over Japan once again, not with atomic bombs, but with leaflets. They warned of further destruction unless surrender came immediately. By August 14th, Hirohito made his decision. Japan accepted the terms of the Potsdam Declaration. The war, which had consumed 6 years, 6 continents, and over 60 million lives, was over, and at its center, marking both its conclusion and its moral fracture, stood the silver outline of the B-29. The B-29 had begun as a bomber, an extension of air power and industrial might. But by the summer of 1945, it had become a symbol of something far greater and far more troubling. Its creation had demanded unprecedented resources. $3.5 billion in 1940s currency, more than the cost of the entire Manhattan Project. Its development had tested the limits of engineering, remote control systems, pressurization, fire suppression, and the integration of analog computation. Yet the ultimate test came not in the skies over Europe, nor in the Pacific Islands, but in the decision rooms of men who now realized that warfare itself had changed. For the air crews who flew those final missions, the emotional aftermath was complex. They had fulfilled their duty, ended a war, and likely saved millions of lives that would have been lost in an invasion of Japan. But they had also become witnesses and instruments of a weapon whose moral weight would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Tibbets remained steadfast until his death, insisting he would not apologize. Others, like navigator Theodore Dutch van Kirk, later expressed deep reflection. "We had no idea what it would mean. We knew only that we were ending a war. But we also began something we didn't understand." The Japanese who survived called it Picadon, flash boom. For them, the B-29 was not just an airplane, it was the silhouette of apocalypse. In the months following Japan's surrender, hundreds of B-29s stood idle on Pacific airfields. Their engines cooled, their crews disbanded. Their wings gathered dust in the tropical heat. Some were scrapped, others converted for reconnaissance or transport. But the image they left behind, the glint of sunlight on silver fuselage at dawn, would endure for generations. For the Germans who had once stared upward at those same contrails in disbelief, the end of the war brought a grim vindication of their fear. The B-29 had not merely been another bomber. It had been the first step into a new epoch of warfare, one where altitude no longer protected, and where destruction no longer required battle. And as history would soon prove, the sight of B-29s at sunrise had been more than terrifying. It had been prophetic. They had seen the future coming. When Japan's surrender was announced on August 15, 1945, the sound that followed was not cheering. It was silence. In the Pacific, on the runways of Tinian and Guam, hundreds of B-29 crews stood beside their machines, listening to radio broadcasts from Tokyo. For months, they had flown through flak and fighters. Now there was only the sea wind and The hum of idling engines, the war that had defined their lives, was over. But the aircraft that had helped end it had also unleashed something that no one yet understood. News of Hiroshima and Nagasaki spread unevenly. Initial reports spoke of a new bomb that had destroyed two cities. Photographs arrived weeks later, aerial shots showing landscapes erased into ash. The world saw not conquest, but absence. In Germany, Allied intelligence officers analyzed the reports with disbelief. For years, the Luftwaffe's scientists had pursued their own dreams of atomic and jet supremacy. Werner Heisenberg's team in Haigerloch had come close to building a reactor but never achieved critical mass. The V-2 program under Werner von Braun had reached the edge of space but lacked the means to carry a nuclear payload. Now, they saw the proof that their adversaries had gone far beyond. In the ruins of Berlin, captured officers whispered of a future where no defense could stand against such weapons, and of an aircraft that could deliver them from half a world away. For the United States, the B-29 was not merely the end of the war, it was the foundation of a new strategic doctrine. Within weeks of VJ Day, the Army Air Forces began drafting plans to adapt the superfortress into a permanent deterrent. The Strategic Air Command, SAC, was formed in 1946, placing long-range bombers at the center of America's post-war security. The B-29's design evolved into the B-50 and, ultimately, the B-47 and B-52, aircraft that would define the Cold War. Each owed its lineage to the pressurized cabin, centralized fire control, and long-range navigation pioneered by the B-29. The Cold War itself, in many ways, was born in the shadow of those final flights over Japan. Washington and Moscow both understood that whoever controlled the skies and the atomic weapons they carried would control the future. The Soviet Union wasted no time. Stalin ordered his intelligence services to obtain a B-29 by any means. In 1945, several U.S. bombers that had made emergency landings in Soviet territory were quietly impounded. Engineers from the Tupolev Design Bureau disassembled them piece by piece. By 1947, an exact reverse-engineered copy took flight, the Tupolev Tu-4. It was so precise that even the American manufacturer's stenciled markings were replicated. The message was unmistakable. The monopoly had ended. The age of mutual nuclear reach had begun. The B-29 also left a deep mark on those who had witnessed its power firsthand. In Japan, survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, hibakusha, became living reminders of what the modern age could inflict. Many suffered from chronic illnesses, radiation sickness, and social stigma for decades. Yet their testimonies would become central to post-war movements advocating disarmament and peace. For American crews, returning home meant reconciling pride with unease. The medals, parades, and commendations could not erase the images burned into memory. The glare on the horizon, the thunder that rolled across the Pacific, the knowledge that nothing could have survived beneath that cloud. Colonel Tibbets, when asked in 1975 if he ever regretted his mission, replied with military precision, "I was sent to do a job, and I did it. That's the way wars are won." But the navigator, Dutch Van Kirk, would later add quietly, "We never talked about it. You just couldn't." The B-29 thus carried two kinds of legacy, one of triumph and one of conscience. It ended the most destructive war in human history, but in doing so, it began an era of permanent tension, one in which peace itself was maintained not by trust, but by fear. By late 1946, hundreds of B-29s were mothballed or scrapped, their aluminum recycled into the growing civilian economy. Yet a few continued to serve, flying humanitarian missions during the Berlin airlift, mapping uncharted territory, and testing nuclear weapons in the Marshall Islands. Their silver wings still reflected the same early morning light that had once terrified German pilots. But now that light had a different meaning. Not the glow of victory, but the glimmer of a future humanity would spend decades trying to understand. In the years following 1945, the B-29 superfortress transitioned from an instrument of destruction to a cornerstone of global strategy. Even as its factories fell silent, its spirit lived on in the evolving doctrine of deterrence, the belief that power, once demonstrated so decisively, must now be preserved to prevent its use again. By 1947, the U.S. Air Force became an independent branch, separating from the Army. Its foundation rested squarely on what the B-29 had proven, that wars could be decided from the sky. At the center of this new air age stood men who had once flown the Pacific, hardened veterans who now trained the next generation of bomber crews. The aircraft itself, though no longer new, was far from obsolete. When the Korean War erupted in 1950, the B-29 returned to battle. Once again, they flew from the Marianas, this time against industrial centers in Pyongyang, Wonsan, and the Yalu River bridges. But the skies had changed. The B-29s that had once ruled, unchallenged at 30,000 feet, now faced something the Luftwaffe could never give them: jet interceptors. The Soviet-built MiG-15s, piloted by North Korean, Chinese, and occasionally Soviet airmen, slashed through the formations with speeds and climb rates the superfortress could not match. In the bitter winter of 1951, entire bomber groups were torn apart in the thin air over the Yalu. Crews who had once flown unopposed now watched contrails spiral toward them, missiles of vapor and fire. It was a grim reversal. The hunter had become the hunted. The B-29, once the most advanced bomber in the world, had reached the end of its era. By 1953, the surviving aircraft were withdrawn to secondary duties: reconnaissance, weather tracking, or target towing. A few were converted into aerial tankers for the jet bombers that would replace them: the B-47 Stratojet and, later, the B-52 Stratofortress. Yet even as they faded from the flight line, their influence remained indelible. Every contour of the new bombers, from their pressurized fuselages to their fire control systems, traced its lineage back to Boeing's 1942 blueprint. The superfortress had changed, not only the outcome of one war, but the philosophy of all wars to follow. Back in Germany, decades after Keller and his fellow pilots had first glimpsed those unreachable silver aircraft at dawn, the memory still lingered. In veterans' meetings, they would speak of the high ones, the American bombers that no Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf could reach. To them, the B-29 symbolized not defeat, but the arrival of something beyond comprehension, the technological leap that marked the twilight of an age when men could still fight war on equal terms. In Japan, the aircraft took on a different meaning. At Hiroshima Peace Memorial Park, a simple plaque mentions the name Enola Gay. Visitors stand beneath the shadow of the Genbaku Dome, staring upward at the open sky, the same sky from which that shadow once descended. The B-29's role in ending the war cannot be separated from the suffering it caused. It exists in history as both savior and destroyer, a paradox made of metal and fire. Today, only a handful of B-29s survive. Most sit silent in museums, their polished wings reflecting fluorescent light instead of the rising sun. One, however, still flies. Fifi, maintained by the Commemorative Air Force. When its engines ignite, the sound is unmistakable, deep, steady, resonant, echoing across airfields as if waking ghosts. Each takeoff is a history lesson made real. The flight engineers trace the same. Switches and dials that once carried the world to the edge of annihilation. Spectators watch in reverent silence as the superfortress lifts once more, silver against the sky, a reminder of an era when altitude equaled power, and when power carried a cost beyond measure. By the time the jet age matured, the B-29 had become more than an aircraft. It was a marker on the timeline of civilization. It bridged the world of piston engines and nuclear weapons, of propellers and politics. From the perspective of history, its greatest achievement was not merely ending a war, but forcing humanity to confront the limits of its own creation. In the quiet decades that followed, the sight of a B-29 at sunrise, those gleaming wings stretching into the light, remained an image not of terror, but of remembrance. It was no longer the enemy's nightmare. It had become the world's conscience. History rarely measures progress by mercy. It counts victories in tons of bombs dropped, cities burned and enemies defeated. But somewhere between the roar of engines and the silence that follows, the story of the B-29 tells something more. The moment when humanity learned just how high it could climb and how far it could fall. The superfortress was not merely a machine, it was a mirror. Every rivet, every turbine blade, reflected the brilliance and the burden of human invention. It carried scientists, engineers, and airmen to the edge of possibility, and then showed them what waited beyond. In its shadow, moral boundaries blurred, the same aircraft that fed the flames. Over Tokyo also dropped the weapons that ended the war. Weapons so powerful that no nation would dare use them again. When German pilots first saw those shining wings at sunrise, they saw the future, silent, untouchable, beyond reach. They did not yet know that the same light would soon fall over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that the glow of dawn would become the glow of history's darkest hour. The B-29 had rendered the old world obsolete, the world of chivalry in the sky, of dogfights and honor, replaced by altitude, range, and annihilation from afar. And yet, within that contradiction lies its true meaning. For all its destruction, the superfortress became the foundation of deterrence, the paradoxical peace forged through fear. It forced the world to reconsider what war should be, and whether civilization could survive its own inventions. Today, when one of those remaining aircraft takes flight, the sound is not triumph but remembrance. The engines thunder not as a declaration of power, but as an echo, reminding us that mastery of the skies came at the price of conscience. At sunrise, when its wings catch the light, it no longer symbolizes domination. It stands for the moment when humanity learned that victory without compassion is hollow, that progress, untempered by wisdom, becomes peril. And so, in the reflection of those silver wings, the world still sees itself, forever reaching higher, forever haunted by the shadow it casts.